The Nemesis Dreadknight has long been the subject of Grey Knight players' ire. Often referred to as the baby carrier, this unusual walker design seems to run counter to the Grey Knight's grim task of facing off against the ruinous powers. You can imagine my surprise when, a few months ago, the new Grandmaster flavour of Nemesis Dreadknight was announced. The new parts are a nice addition, but the original design remains. So when Games Workshop said that they will be sending me the new Grey Knight Sanctic Conclave box, I knew that I had to do a little redesign myself. So join me as I set out to build a better Nemesis Dreadknight. My first step was to pretty much disregard the bulk of the Dreadknight kit and instead use the new Saturnine Dreadnought from the Horus Heresy as my framework. Not only is the kit roughly the same size as the Dreadknight, it also eliminates the open-air nature of the pilot and looks incredibly cool. So with this in mind, I began the process of building the legs, waist and torso as per the instructions. I did, however, keep these separate from each other for the time being. This was so that, once all the separate parts were prepped, I could remove the small tabs that locked the legs into a particular pose. These chunks of plastic were clipped away and smoothed out to create an easily posable ball and socket joint. With the pegs removed, I arranged the legs in a slightly more dynamic pose, with the left leg being slightly ahead of the torso and the right leg being lifted up. With the legs glued, the tabs were also removed from the feet and were positioned to match the legs. So far, my Dreadknight was just a Saturnine Dreadnought, but this would change when I came to tackling the arms. Normally, the Saturnine Dread has weapons mounted onto its arms rather than the robo-hands, melee weapons and wrist-mounted cannons of the Dreadknight. And the easiest way to resolve this issue was to simply combine the Dreadknight's arms with the Dreadnought's shoulders. After a quick comparison, I used my saw to remove the ball joint of the Dreadknight arms. I'd recommend doing this before you glue the halves together though, and just make sure you follow the line of the arm to ensure a flat, even cut. Once the ball joint was removed and cleaned up, the arm was glued together, and the whole process was repeated on the second arm. I was quite fortunate when it came to attaching the arms to the shoulders, as the slightly indented area was the perfect size to accommodate the Dreadknight's arms. Once the arms had been attached to their new shoulders, I continued to assemble the torso using the more Grey Knight looking pieces found in the Saturnine kit. Finally, the torso was glued to the waist and twisted to match the posing of the legs. The new Nemesis Dreadknight kit comes with new options for the Grandmaster, namely a mace and a flail. I opted to build the latter of these two weapons where I first assembled the handle. The chain attaches to the handle using a ball joint, which meant that I was able to do a quick dry fit to ensure that the flail pulled the chain in a direction that made sense based on the walker's movement. Once the flail was assembled, it was glued to the arm, followed by the head to the torso. When it came to attaching the wrist-mounted weaponry, I had a slight problem with some of the elbow nubs. These normally attach to the pistons that support the Dreadknight's arms, but as I wasn't using these, the nubs were unnecessary. So they were clipped away. This did leave behind an odd gap, though, once the arm's weaponry had been built and attached, but it was quite easy to cover these up with a couple of Grey Knight Terminator tilt shields. With the bulk of the model complete, I could turn my attention towards the smaller and more decorative details. These began with the chest-mounted weaponry of the Saturnine Dreadnought. I began with the concussive resonator option, but left the front caps off. Instead, I would recreate the Grandmaster's Fragstorm grenade launcher by taking the Fragstorm grenade launcher from some Space Marine aggressors. After clipping away and cleaning up the frag sections, they were then glued to the resonator bodies and then to the torso. To better separate my Dreadknight from its Saturnine origins, I opted to not include the shoulder pads. Fortunately, the torso was still extremely well detailed and worked even without the shoulder pads. There were, however, a few gaps where the pads would have attached to the torso that needed to be filled in. I filled these in with the caps off the shoulder pad's ridge. 2 of these were cut down, trimmed flat and glued over the holes, and the remaining 2 were then attached to some gaps just above the shoulder joints. Next up were the more Grey Knight specific details. These included a Nemesis Dreadknight tilt shield that was glued to the chest, and some Grandmaster knee pads which, after having their pegs clipped away, were glued over the Saturnine's knees. In addition to using the Grandmaster knee pads, I also wanted to add the new tabard found in the kit. I decided to mount this just below the central torso plate, which required me to adjust the chains a little to accommodate the sloping armour. I didn't glue the tabard onto the model just yet though. I decided to keep this separate to make painting both parts a little easier. Continuing with the Grandmaster parts, I also borrowed the halo. After first comparing this above the head, I made a few clips and trims until the two could be joined with some glue. By this point, all that was missing were the purity seals. These were sourced from various Grey Knight kits, but I didn't glue them to the model yet. These were instead attached to a temporary holder, a bit of bamboo stick with some double-sided sticky tape, to be painted separately, which brought me to the base. I kept things quite straightforward here, and used my usual torn-up cork floor tiles arranged to create rocky outcrops. In addition to these, some Milliput bricks were scattered across the base. I'll link to a video where I detail how these were made. Once the rocks and bricks were in place, with enough space being left for the feet of course, I finished things off with a few skulls and helmets from the Battlefield Trophies kit. All that was left to do now was to glue the arm and foot to some smaller temporary bases and attach a piece of wire to the back of the tabard to help hold it whilst painting, which I was now ready to begin. This process was kicked off with the all-important primer step. For the bulk of the model, I opted to use a gloss black primer, which I applied via my airbrush. The glossiness of this particular paint would help massively when I came to paint on the iconic silver of the Grey Knight's armour, whilst also having the usual helpful properties of a primer coat. For some of the separate details, however, I instead decided to use some Rattlecam primers, specifically Reliquary Red, Dead Animal Bits, and Hyrax Brown from the Colourforge. These were used on the tabard, purity seals, and base respectively to create a helpful starting colour. But before we go any further with the painting, let's hear from the sponsors of this video. Me, or more specifically, my Dead Animal Bits kit. More regular viewers will already be aware that this is my very own kit, which is packed full of over 300 hard plastic bits, ready to adorn your miniatures, bases, and scenery. Inside you'll find all manner of expired creature parts, including shark jaws, bull horns, rib cages, femurs, impaled hands, severed heads, ram's horns, antlers, feathers, teeth, and more. So whether you're looking to add some grotesque mutations, grisly trophies, or just some battlefield debris to your miniatures, then this kit has something in it for you. Oh, and don't worry, it's not resin, sourcast, or even 3D printed. Everything is made from that same hard plastic Games Workshop miniatures are made from, making it the perfect kit for clipping, trimming, and adjusting into whatever shape you need it to be. So if you're planning that next kit bash, or you just need some bones to add to your bases, Dead Animal Bits has you covered. You can pick these up on my very own web store, thesparepartsemporium.com, where I have full boxes for those bigger projects, and even individual sprues if you just want to see what the kit has to offer. I also package and ship everything from that web store myself, so anything you buy there goes directly to supporting this channel and the production of future kits. You can find all those links down in the description below, but for now, let's get back to the painting. When it comes to the Grey Knights, you need to get their iconic silver armor right, which is why I decided to use an old favorite of mine, Vallejo Metal Color Steel, as a jumping off point. These metallics are great for airbrushing with and allow me to steadily build up a bright, reflective metallic across the surface of my Dreadknight. As I use an airbrush for this, I also added a little light shading by focusing my application from above the model and leaving the deeper, recessed areas as a darker steel. Following on from my first layer of steel, I switched to the even brighter silver. Again, my direction of application was from above to simulate how light would reflect more from the upper areas of the models. After a few thin layers, the silver was ready to be painted over. Another important detail of Grey Knight armor that I wanted to recreate was that slightly blue tinge to it. I've always imagined this as a manifestation of the various blessings, wards, and psychic barriers which help to keep the knight safe when facing off against the horrors of the warp. And to help me to create this effect, I turned to the Pro Acryl range, specifically their Newsh and Transparent Blue. If you saw my previous video, you will already be aware of what Newsh is, but it's essentially an acrylic medium that effectively increases the drying time of your paint, allowing you to adjust it after application. With this in mind, I added some Pro-Acryl Transparent Blue to a little Newsh and applied it to the silver armour. Then, whilst the mixture was still wet, I wiped it away with a dampened glasses cleaning cloth. As these are fabric, they are lint-free and reusable. After wiping away the excess, the mixture was left behind only in the recesses. Once it dried, it created that subtle blue tone that I was looking for. I repeated this process across the entirety of the armour, focusing on one small section at a time and reapplying it when necessary. Once done, I was left with that Grey Knight blue-silver armour. From here, I turned my attention to the areas of the steel that weren't specifically a part of the armour. These included the various mechanical joints, some of the pipes and the metal parts of the weapons, and for these I used some more Newsh. But this time I mixed in some transparent black. By using the same method of application as before, the mixture left the recesses looking much darker without impacting on the surfaces as much as a similar wash would have done. With the armour and steel details base coated and shaded, I could begin working on the remaining base coats, starting with the red areas. These included the stock of the weapons, purity seals, as well as some heraldry that I wanted to recreate. For all of these, I used some Berserker Red from the 2 thin coats range, and unsurprisingly, I made sure to paint at least 2 thinned coats across these details. Painting over metallics can be tricky, so make sure you thin your paint a little and apply several thin layers to prevent that metallic surface from showing through. I continued the base coats with some Carcharodon Grey, which I used to both continue the heraldic designs as well as picking out some of the smaller details, such as the skull on the knee pad. To finish off the tilt shield and to base coat all of the pipes and cables, I used some Death Reaper. Next, I returned to the metallics and tackled all of the more copper coloured details with some Spartan Bronze. These details included, but were not limited to, the heat shrouds of the weaponry, storage tanks, and vents. All that was left now were the more decorative details, which I painted using some Glistening Gold. With the base coats complete, I broke out the Newsh and mixed in some of Pro-Acryl's Transparent Brown. Like before, this was used to add a little shading to the surfaces, and I focused my application to the copper and gold coated areas, as well as the parchment of the purity seals. These details were a little smaller than before though, so I was a lot more careful with my initial application. For the areas where I had painted with Berserker Red, I applied a more regular wash using some Oblivion Black, which brought me neatly to the highlights. For some of these highlights, I used 2 paints. The first was used to line the edges and details, with the second being used to pick out the sharper points or corners, what I like to call an extreme highlight. For my first highlight, I used some Sanguine Scarlet across the red areas, before picking out the sharpest details like the corners and rivets using some Demon Red. For the details that I had painted with Carcharodon Grey, I applied just a single highlight of White Star. To highlight the dark grey details, I first used some Dungeonstone Grey, followed by some small spots of Wizard Grey. The edges of the parchment were then picked out with some Vampire Fang, before coming full circle back to the metallics, where I picked out the armor edges with some Mythril Blade. The darker copper details were then highlighted with Dragon's Gold, and finally, Glistening Gold was used for all of the golden decorations. With all of my highlights completed, I just had those final few details left to tackle. The first of these details were the heraldic markings. I wanted to apply the decals to the tilt shield and leg, but before I could do anything, I first needed to prepare the surface with a coat of gloss varnish. As this dried, I picked out my decals. Now, the Grey Knights don't actually have their own transfer sheet, so I had to borrow some from the Space Marine and Dark Angels range. I ultimately settled on the White Sword and Red Sun. With the surface prepped and the decals picked, I soaked my transfers in a little water until they started to lift from the backing paper. At this point, I carefully teased the transfers from their backing onto my Dreadknight and used a damp brush to adjust. After being allowed to dry, I then hit them with a little microsol. This is a mild acid that simply softens the transfer to allow it to better conform to the surface where you've placed it on. This, combined with the smooth surface afforded by the glass varnish, ensured that the decal didn't have that outline around the outside. After a couple of applications of the microsol, I left the decal to fully dry. To fix the transfers in place and to remove that glossiness, I then hit the decals with some matte varnish. The final details to paint were the eye lenses and a few of the glowing vents. To create a simple glowing effect, I first base coated these sections with some white star, before breaking out the Newsh, mixing it with some turquoise and applying it across those same areas. As I removed the excess with my cloth, the turquoise remained in the recesses, which helped to create that glowing effect. And with that, the Dreadknight was complete and I could return to working on the base. Now, how you paint your bases is entirely up to you, but I decided to go for a contrasting dark grey and pale brown, which I achieved with a couple of quick dry brushing steps. For the first of these, I used some Dungeonstone Grey. As I dry brushed the grey paint over the reddish-brown primer of Hyrax Brown, it slowly built up across the craggy details of the rocks. These rocks were then further emphasised with my second dry brush, where I used the lighter paint of Carcharodon Grey and a lighter application. This ensured that only the most prominent points picked up the paint. For the various skulls and helmets littered across the base, I first used some Dragon Fang and simply repeated my earlier steps to create some Black Legion helmets. Now that the cork and extra details had been base coated, I could now start to fill in all those gaps between the rubble. For this, I used some of AK Interactive's Dry Ground Texture Paste. This is a thick paste that, when painted generously across the base, will create a sandy, uneven texture. For my first layer, I filled in all the gaps, but left enough room for the feet to be added. At which point, I shaved clean the contact point of both the feet and the base before gluing the Dreadknight into place. With the feet in place, any remaining gaps were filled in with more AK dry ground before the paste was left to fully dry. The dry ground was a good start, but was much too light for the effect that I wanted, so I broke out the Newsh one final time. For this step, I mixed in some scorched earth and applied this quite liberally across the whole base, wiping away the excess as always. To help emphasize that sandy texture, one final pass of ivory tusk was made using my dry brush. Now, all that was left to do was to finish the highlights over the base details and attach the tabard and purity seals. Like with the base, I made sure to scrape clean the contact points first to ensure a strong fit. I then cleaned up the rim of the base with a flat black marker, also from AK, and gave everything a coat of varnish, leaving me with this. And here we have my take on the Grandmaster in Nemesis Dreadknight armor. With everything painted up, I think all of the small Grey Knight details mount up to create something that is clearly of the Grey Knight, and, at least in my opinion, looks better than the baby carrier design. Now, I'm certainly not the first person to attempt to fix this design, but at least at the time of making this video, I believe I'm the first person to use the Saturnine Dreadnought as a base. Now, is this method practical or even financially responsible? No, not at all. But when has that ever stopped kitbashers before? Now, if you're interested in sprucing up your own Grey Knights with a shiny new take on the Dreadknight, I'll include all the parts and paints that I use in this video down in the description, along with some affiliate links to where you can pick them up from. And as I mentioned earlier, if you're interested in picking up a box of dead animal bits for yourself and you're in the UK or the US, then check out my website, sparepartsemporium.com. If you're in the EU or other parts of the world, then you can also find them on the Wargames Atlantic web store as well, which I'll also include a link to. But before I go, let me say a huge thank you to everyone who continues to help keep the channel going. And if you'd like to support me too, you can get early access to ad-free videos, exclusive merchandise, and even your name in the credits. Simply follow my Patreon link below or hit the join button. Just like my top Patreon supporters did, who are Nail5, Andrew Butler, Ban Yevrian, Berserker, Dakota Gaburi, Daniel Dowling, Eben Holes, George Kanzini Roberts, Immortal Creations, Cornbread, Little Templar, Matt J. Savitsky, Matt Brower, Molly Mork, Neil Vickers, Older Than Time, Sam Sepulveda, Swedsman, and Tim. And my top channel members, who are Bon Johnson, Daniel Reese, Dave, Doug H, Dwarf of War, Guy Bazant, John Gibbs, Lord Benjamin, Mark Taylor, Mr. Pogon, Nerdington Paints, Omnitom, Patrick K, Philip Poyer, Ryan O'Shaughnessy, S.O., Satoran, S.J. Carper, The Sire Acquired, and Whale Tussler. So until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye.